Hi, and welcome to EdVantage. My name is Marie Hunsinger, and today I'm going to talk about the consequences of global stratification. One of the biggest differences between poor and rich countries is in the population level or population growth. In less developed countries and poorer countries, women on average tend to have about 5 children per woman. Compared to wealthier and more industrialized countries, women tend to have on average about 2 children. And so we see much of the world's population growth occurring in the peripheral or the poorer countries. And this is due to many reasons. For example, lack of education, marrying of girls very young, perhaps 12, 13, and so they start bearing children very early, and also lack of reproductive technologies like birth control, or resistance to condoms by males in that population. Also, a big difference between poor and rich countries is standard of living and life expectancy. So we can see in the wealthier countries that life expectancy tends to be 75 or 80 plus years, compared to lower countries. It could be lower income countries, it could be less than age 50 that someone is expected to live. And this is also due to advances in medical technology and pharmaceuticals that residents of wealthier countries have access to. Also tend to have higher education levels, tend to know more about nutrition, access to healthy foods, access to clean water, access to sanitation are all reasons why the life expectancy tends to be higher in wealthier countries. Another consequence of global stratification is education and literacy. So around the world, in industrialized, wealthier countries or poor countries, we tend to take literacy for granted. About 99% of the world's core countries are literate, compared to about 62% in sub-Saharan Africa. Around the world, 90% of males are literate, compared to 82% of women. So women are about 2/3 of the world's illiterate population. So we take for granted that education is a human right and universal in the United States. The majority of children attend school to at least some level, depending on the state. Age 16 would be a common age, and some go much higher than that. But around the world, that's not the case. And there's also global stratification when it comes to gender. So we already learned that women have a lower literacy rate compared to men. Around the world, men tend to have higher labor participation rates compared to women. They tend to own more wealth. They tend to earn higher incomes compared to women. So the Gender Inequality Index is a composite of 3 key components of women's lives, and this is how we kind of determine the gender inequality in a country. And so they look at reproductive health. So what this means is that you have access to reproductive technologies, you have control over when, how, and how often you have children, you have the right to safe sex. Another one is empowerment, that you have control over your life, that you have the opportunity to seek institutions like education in the workplace. And the third measure is labor market status. So this is just participation in the economy and the paid labor force in some way. Now it's important to note that just because a woman is not in the paid labor force doesn't mean that she's not doing any labor. A lot of women do a high level of unpaid work, such as child rearing, domestic care around the house, cooking, cleaning. That's just not paid. World poverty, so we tend to put poverty into 2 categories, relative and extreme. So relative poverty is a measure of poverty relative to the rest of the US on average. Comparatively extreme poverty is used worldwide. It's defined as surviving on only $1.90 a day, which includes about 10% of the world's population. So even the poorest people in the United States are nowhere near the poverty level of some of the poorest people in the poorest countries. So it's important, you can be poor in a high standard of living country, or you can be very poor in a poor country with a low standard of living. It's important to note, though, that we have made great strides and progress when it comes to reducing world poverty. The majority of the world's poor now are in sub-Saharan Africa, but we've made great strides in like Central Asia, the Pacific Islands, and some other areas of the world that were previously very poor. So what causes world poverty? Well, this is a very complex issue with multi-causal factors. One of the reasons is climate change, and climate change influences the land, such as droughts, so the inability to access water, and droughts can also cause a failure in crops. And so this is threatening the livelihood of many traditional industries like farming and agriculture, and also causes some people to be called climate refugees, meaning that they're no longer able to stay in the place that they were born and raised because of inhabitable geographic reasons. Another reason is war and conflict. So war tends to harm a society in a lot of different ways. It tends to have a destruction of infrastructure, also tends to kill a large portion of the male population, leaving women and children. And women, since women tend to make less in the paid labor force anyway, this causes poverty. Also changes in the world economic system. So as we were talking about climate change and the decline of agriculture. And finally, unstable governments or corrupt governments that do not have robust social safety nets for people who really need it. Like in the United States, we have social welfare programs like food stamps, housing vouchers, and TANF. So thanks for tuning in to today's video on the consequences of global stratification. I hope to see you next time. Bye.